Thank you, Andrew, for having me here and giving me this opportunity. I don't want to focus too much on our frameworks, although they certainly are a reflection of what we think about the scene now, and obviously we have to think about the future. But I want to prevent too much self-promotion in this sense, so I'm trying to keep it as general as I can. Maybe a bit about myself. My background is in pharmacy, and then I kind of diverged into the computational realm during my PhD in pharmacology. And now I'm basically a full-time computational researcher. I'm very interested in open source principles and software development, and also AI and how they work. And there were already quite some big chunks of information that you got about this in the preceding three seminars. And to start off, I would like to start with the motivation, something that comes also from my background in pharmacy, and that you probably all have heard in some form or other, that correlation is not causation, which seems superficially trivial. But if you venture into the high-dimensional biology space, then you very quickly notice that this is not at all simple. So, for example, if you try to determine the impact of nature versus nurture on any given trait or disease in biomedical research, then you often hit what we call the curse of dimensionality fairly quickly. And in high dimensional spaces, it's not really easy to disentangle correlation from causation. And this is even more complicated by the fact that most of our modern experiments, due to their specialization, involve lots of different modalities that we need to introduce into the experiments and lots of conditionals that we need to be aware of. And since the recent boom in generative AI, it is now all too natural to think that they can help in cutting us through these complexities in the same way that they can help you, for example, creating beautiful illustrations such as this one in a matter of minutes, which otherwise would have taken me probably several hours, or if I wanted to do it in minutes, it would have looked rather like this. And going beyond this initial level of artwork obviously is more challenging, and there's a lot of work still to be done. And so we have recently written a perspective on translating this into the molecular realm. So on the left here, we see a human-made diagram of the EGF pathway and the different components. What would happen if you interfere with one of these components for treatment reasons? And then if you ask GPT-4 and DALL-E 3, which at the time were the cutting edge of image generation, to do the same thing, and given that GPT-4 knows everything about all of these components, so what the EGF receptor does, how the components are connected, what functions else they have, the drugs, etc., then what you ultimately get from the diffusion model, and this comes as a surprise to probably the fewest people, is nice looking, but mainly nonsense. And for a machine learning researcher, that's not really a surprise, but the really difficult thing is how do we get the models to go from this very aesthetically pleasing but ultimately meaningless illustration to something that can fulfill a purpose and help us in biomedical research. So in this perspective, we were looking at the different models that we have in terms of complexity, going all the way from the low parameter models, like a linear model that you would use to evaluate the results of a randomized clinical trial, through the more highly parameterized deep models, up all the way until the newly minted foundation models and their unimaginable parameter spaces. And also ask the question, how does the knowledge, the biological knowledge or whichever knowledge we put into these models, lead to their inductive biases? So lead to the predictions that they make and whether they're useful or not. And how is this related to causality? And what was interesting is that they may use the knowledge in certain ways, but the more complicated the models get, the more parameters they have, the less intuitive it becomes how they use the knowledge and how they kind of turn the paradigms that we intuitively think on their heads. So this as a motivation for the general principle of productivity, and obviously many people think of productivity when we now have LLMs and agent systems that should help us in these tasks. And there are these kinds of tasks, so like very high level tasks, thinking about a hard problem for a long time, etc. But there's also another kind of task that we have, and that is more the menial, tedious kind of task. And depending on who you ask in the field, it may even be that this is the majority of the time that you spend in your day-to-day work by finding out where to get data, cleaning it, maybe, as Melanie has told you, labeling stuff or having an active learning approach to train a model that is useful. And I think these are the tasks that are very useful to focus on. So why do I think that? And I think this is a good point to recall the background that was given, particularly by Andrew and Melanie, in the way that these models work. So how do they get their biases? How do they complete the text that we input into them? And also, why do they behave the way they do, which is mainly driven by the data sets that you put into the models. And in the case of the general purpose large language models, that is all text on the internet processed by some very opaque mechanism. So we recall that they are probabilistic next token generators, which leads to the two main problems that we have in applying them robustly. And I like to disentangle between confabulation and hallucination. Often people just say one of the two. I like to be very specific in saying that the confabulations are the behaviors that generate false information, but that appears correct. So particularly if you don't know yourself the answer to a question, this is the behavior that is very convincing, but ultimately wrong. Whereas hallucinations are more like the generation of seemingly unrelated text. So things that diverge from the original task that the models were given. Furthermore, alignment with human concepts and the expectations that we have towards the models, because we project the expectations that we bring from our previous interactions with humans to the LLMs, makes this very difficult. So LLMs currently cannot be calibrated, which means that they don't give you a number of the certainty of the whichever fact they tell you. And they also cannot themselves say when they're asked, how certain are you? There is this paradigm of garbage in, garbage out, if you recall Melanie's seminar, which means that if you train on the wrong data or you fine tune on the wrong data, then you may get the wrong behaviors. And the ultimate problem is that if you yourself don't know the answer to a question, then this problem of them generating falsehoods that are very convincing is quite dangerous. So application in fields or tasks where we have limited understanding is pretty dangerous with these models. This ties to the principles that I think are very important, particularly in research, as compared to the big companies that are very rapidly developing generation after generation of these models. And where we have this use case that probably many of you are interested in, which is that you have an end user that you would like to support in a task that can be a scientist, a clinician, or whichever else kind of user you can imagine. And then you have a top layer of application developers that develop an application for this type of user. And the strength of LLMs is that the user can interact with the software in language, which for most people is not a problem. Then if we go one level deeper, we get framework components with which these custom applications are built. And this includes, for example, BioChatter that we have built for the biomedical ecosystem in order to get to these custom applications. And so we use these components to build them. And then ideally, we also give back to these component developers, for example, the use cases, experiences, so that the framework components can get better. And the same happens at the level one step down, where basic libraries are created by library developers, which are used in these frameworks. And ideally, the communication goes both ways. What we generally see in the terms of software development is that the complexity rises to the top, to the custom applications, because they often need to incorporate many different aspects and are tuned to a specific user group. whereas the basic libraries are sometimes developing at a very rapid pace. LangChain is a good example because they have nearly daily releases with a large community, and it needs a lot of work by the component developers to keep up with all the stuff that's going on in the basic libraries. So we do have a lot of knowledge, and we do have a lot of tooling to deal with that knowledge, but knowledge isn't everything. And we still need to, in each of these use cases, use the knowledge to generate some insight. So we would, for example, like to use a bunch of different aggregated data on molecular and phenotypic information to drive the development of new drugs. And we were inspired by the rapid rise of popularity of LLMs to extend our ecosystem towards the LLM area, and that is what BioChatter is. It revolves around this typical loop that everybody has grown accustomed to, which is you have a question and you go to a language model and you hope that the language model will help you solving this question. And what people noticed fairly quickly after the third generation of GPT, I would say, is that you can really improve performance of the models if you specifically instruct them for the task that you have. One simple thing that you can do, and this is one of the first things that we implemented as well, is that you can engineer your prompts. And if you know about the methods in the bioinformatics space, for example, that you can use to drive the experimentation or to drive the insights, then you can describe this to the LLM, and then you will probably get a more relevant response to your particular problem. But nowadays, the agent-based modeling and the secondary systems are much more popular than the basic prompt engineering, which people kind of want to get rid of, although not successfully yet. So we, for example, connect knowledge graphs. There is this framework we did before, which is called BioCipher, that we can connect for retrieval-augmented generation. But we can also connect, for example, a vector database and then perform semantic search given a particular question. Then models can now also parameterize APIs. So you can use other software by going through a language model, probably multiple language models, and then get the results from that software. And you can also chain language models together, or you can even chain them to other models like computer vision models or genetic models or whatever you think could be useful. We look a lot for being accessible. So we try to be very flexible in the mode of access. Obviously, we have a Python library that is the core of the functionality, but we also provide access through different user interfaces, a light interface, which is just in pure Python based on Streamlit, and a more fancy interface based on Next.js. And we also have a REST server that you can put between layers. And we naturally connect to these other technologies also through the Python API. And we have a bunch of use cases and vignettes that you can see for yourself on biochatter.org. Now, what do we mean when we say something like a developer toolkit for biomedical solutions with LLMs? There was this analogy that a LinkedIn user has made when we published the manuscript, which is trying to describe it like switching from cutting down trees. If you want a new wardrobe, to rather going to IKEA and getting like a nice compact package with the instruction where you can build your wardrobe in half an hour. And I liked it so much that I added it to this presentation. And we also had several use cases in the BioChatter publication. The primary one was in cancer genetics, because we were active in Horizon 2020 project, which dealt with a molecular tumor board application for ovarian cancer. So we created the use case around this. And this I want to use to explain how you would use the developer toolkit. So you come from your basic challenge. In this case, it was create an interface for the geneticists and oncologists in the tumor board that aim to do molecular insights for the patients that we have. And the first thing that you do is you try to set up this particular custom solution. And in this case, we talk to a main LLM, and then the main LLM can also refer back to other components of the system, for example, databases or software tools, and you connect these to the specific repositories where you have your data or your tools. You can have an agent system that also does some looping feedback mechanisms. And then the point where we accelerate the development is that we have a modular dynamic selection system. So for example, you definitely need models for each of these individual agents, for the main LLM as well as for the individual agents. And for this, you can select from a variety of different deployment methods. You can obviously connect to public providers like OpenAI, but you can also host your own models through Ollama or through X-inference. And then you also want to set up these models with specific instructions. So the main LLM gets an instruction like you are an assistant to a cancer geneticist, tumor board, etc. Then we create the knowledge stores, which provide the retrieval-augmented generation mechanisms with the knowledge. In this case, it is a knowledge graph that we built for the patient data, which includes clinical and molecular measurements, their histories, the different variants that they have in the mutations, and what they might mean for treatment, and a vector database that has 40-something papers about ovarian cancer. And then you can also connect it to external tools. The most important external tool that we had in this application was OncoKB, which is a web resource that can tell you about the therapeutic implications of specific mutations in cancer. So would a specific drug be indicated if the patient has this or that variant? And importantly, most of this is open source, except for example, the very inappropriately named OpenAI. And we aim to keep it that way, to keep this community aspect going. Now, this is quite abstract. How does it look like when we actually try to do it? We have a vignette on the documentation that you can look at it yourself. And briefly, what we did was we first built a knowledge graph pipeline in a GitHub repository where we inserted all of this information, and this knowledge graph then has patients with their histories. It has the different genes and the mutations that we have in these genes, and then it connects to drugs and different variants that may make treatment available given a specific association in the OncoKB database, for example, and so on. And then in the same repository where we built the knowledge graph, we also add other services to the Docker Compose workflow, which builds the knowledge graph. And there are two choices that we have in the BioChatter ecosystem, which is the Lite app, this Python thing, which you can use for prototyping, and then this more fancy REST server Next.js frontend, which you can add just as an image from our Docker Hub, and then it will deploy it with the configurations that you do there. For example, you can set environment variables where you give a URL and maybe a custom configuration file. And this looks like this, where we, for example, say we want to connect to a knowledge graph, which is this here. So we point it to a specific URL and a vector database, which sits at this URL, or maybe also is hosted locally in the same Docker Compose. Then we also say we want to maybe connect to OncoKB. And then we also can configure the landing page. So the information for the user, what is this thing even? What can it do? What can it not do? And this you can set up here in this like markdown format. And then we also set up the prompts very importantly. So in this case, we see we have one for the cancer genetics assistant, and you can have a list there. If you have like a more multi-purpose tool, then you could also put multiple of these masks or personas there, and then the user can select from these. To create such a software is not everything, in my opinion, because we also need to make sure, particularly now that things are going very fast, that what we see are actually robust results and that we don't deploy something that is maybe not mature enough, and then the user is disappointed, and then they think for 5 years that LLMs just can't really help you in this. So what we suggest in every case is that we create a dedicated benchmark, and we have done several of these now in various application areas. And for example, in this case, for the tumor board, we think of the typical user, what kinds of questions the user would have, and then design a benchmark which is kind of like a unit test, but directed at the LLM specifically to figure out whether they can or cannot answer a certain question. And this is kind of an art to define these tests so that they give you insight into the real world behavior of the models. And what we do technically is we have a definition through YAML files where we set up the different aspects of the test. So we have obviously different models, but we also have different prompts. You can experiment, for example, between very short and very elaborate system prompts, and other aspects like you can test different knowledge graph schemas and whether the performance differs, etc. And then we have a PyTest matrix that just combines all of these different possibilities to then give you a battery, a very long battery of combinatorial benchmark tests, which you can execute. And you can, if a new model is on the scene and we integrate it into BioChatter, you can immediately run the benchmark on this model again, and you see it in comparison to the others. So this is a kind of outdated uh, overview of like the overall scores of the models. We have this on the website in the benchmarking section as kind of a living benchmark. So every time we run the benchmark, it gets updated. And I don't want to go into depth too much, but we see that there is like an older generation of open source models, and these x-axis annotations are the bit rates with which the parameters are quantized. And we see that there is like a sweet spot around 4-bit. And then there are some open source models that can catch up to these closed source models, GPT and Claude, that we have on the right here. So Llama 3.1, for example, at this point in time was almost at the level of GPT. And we can use this and all the granular individual tests that we do to get a quick impression of which model could be used for which task. Prospectively, we want to strengthen the knowledge management ecosystem, and this is also the tie that we have to the EBI via open targets. We have 2 frameworks now, and what we are looking towards starting next is a 3rd framework, which uses the same kind of layout. So we have in the center, we have this knowledge graph schema that is also grounded into ontology, which is not just used by the representation, but it's also used in BioChatter to inform the LLM what is this data set that I'm interacting with, which is very important because contextualizing LLM responses really improves performance. And we also want to use this knowledge about the context, like we are in biomedicine and we're maybe interested in drugs and drug targets and protein functions, to then facilitate also the extraction of information from unstructured materials. Traditionally, that's mainly text, but now with multimodal models, we can also think of extracting information from other things like combined text and image, for example. And what I think is particularly important is to strengthen the community and avoid this reinvention of the wheel that happens a lot in biomedical science, and to have some shared experiences and maybe even shared softwares for this. So a unified API for the knowledge management will be a big step forward because then the onboarding into the system just becomes easier. We also want to connect more closely with the downstream machine learning, so not just LLMs, but also now obviously foundation models in other modalities like the molecular layers, increase the robustness of machine learning data management, including the metadata automation, because having good data sets, well annotated data sets, as you heard from Melanie before, is really the big thing. But everybody wants to do the model developments, and not a lot of people want to do the metadata. So automation is really important here. So the seminar was also titled Future, Where Does It Go? It is quite difficult to say where it goes because the developments are very, very rapid, and there are many high stakes companies involved in the developments. And there is this nice quote from Niels Bohr that prediction is hard, particularly when we want to predict the future. And I feel this is doubly true in this case. There is a lot of buzz, which, there is a lot of money, so there is always a lot of buzz around the thought of AGI. And if you listen to the CEOs of these companies, then it seems always like AGI is just around the corner if we can just pour a couple billion more into maybe buying NVIDIA cards. But the more critical observers of the ecosystem, and I've linked these here in the slides so you can if you then get the PDF, just look up the papers. Um, there is quite some skepticism, and I'm also more leaning towards the side that this is just marketing, and there are several innovations needed until we get to something that is close to a generalized intelligence. Then there is this problem of difficulty concordance. So undoubtedly, these are intelligent systems, but their intelligence, as I tried to hint at in the beginning, is very different from our intelligence. And so our macroscopic experience with our previous life doesn't really translate into then the expectation what should happen if I give a task to an LLM. There's this very interesting paper that came out recently, which shows that LLMs do not really feel difficulty in the same way that humans feel difficulty. And ironically, the fine-tuning and the secret to success of modern LLMs, or the reinforcement learning from human feedback that companies like OpenAI do to get more alignment with expectations of people, are pretty counterproductive regarding the resilience and the calibration of models for any kind of like easy, medium, or hard task. So, because the PhD level questions are obviously the target of these developments, so ChatGPT can solve a scientific issue in 5 minutes, kind of thing, leads to an over-optimization to these things and to a non-improvement in the very, very trivial range. So problems that would not confuse a human even for a second still fail at the same rate as the very difficult problems, at like 10 to 20%. So we can never fully rely on an LLM, even in the very, very simple tasks. And in part, this has to do with Goodhart's law, which is paraphrased as if a metric becomes the target, then it ceases to be a good metric. And there are plenty benchmarks, but one or two generations of LLMs later, these benchmarks kind of lose their meaning, which is one of the biggest problems that we have nowadays, and which is also why we always suggest to create very specific and ideally also symbolic benchmarks. So benchmarks that are modular and can be freely recombined, because they reveal that the LLMs are unstable to variations that even a 5-year-old child would not be confused by. There's this very interesting paper out of Apple. It's called GSM Symbolic, which I really recommend looking at. And now is the question, what does it need? What does it mean for us in terms of using them, in terms of using them for developments, for others to use, to benefit from the automation that might be possible using LLMs? And clearly, simply not using them may be an answer for a lawyer, but for most of the people that want to work with technology and are progressive, that is clearly not the answer. Because if we don't do something about the application in biomedicine, then people just go to ChatGPT and paste their stuff in there. And very often it is the user behind the screen that is actually the problem, and I don't exclude myself from that. Nobody has time anymore, and reading the docs is very hard. So we need to find good ways to make it clear what each system that we provide or maybe deploy for someone can and cannot do. One very obvious solution, and it's not problematic, so it doesn't need to concern the developers, but the most streamlined thing is educating people, which slowly happens anyways because people get more comfortable with GPT, and I guess in a couple of years or even decades, there will be no question about how to use them and how not to use them. But at the moment, we are at this like very early stage where we need to push the education into the communities. And this also requires this feedback mechanism of people that develop, people that use, and then tell them what worked and what didn't work. This education works for simple systems. So if you have a zero-shot LLM assistant that has a very robust performance and a constrained audience, so it's clear what the system is supposed to do, then often that is not a problem. It also works for the companies, which is fortunate for the companies because they have very generic products like ChatGPT, and they are clearly not responsible in the sense that they just tell you, yeah, you can ask it, but it might be wrong. And For us, it's important that it does not work like that in health critical or high stakes context because there's a lot more regulation and a lot more ethical consideration to be done. So what can we do? I'm a huge fan, which I've mentioned multiple times now, of specific benchmarks, and particularly this principle of unit tests that is very successful in software development, and everybody that does it will tell you it saves them a lot of time after the initial activation energy. So we do benchmarking, right? We try to isolate individual factors of LLM success or failure, and we try to establish a ground level of certainty what we can and cannot put to these models. We also want to monitor it, so we execute it periodically, and ideally we have a setup like continuous integration that automatically does it for us. And it's very important to not use LLMs just because you can. So if you write a software and you want the software to write a file and then read it again, don't use the LLM to cause this behavior. Don't tell the user to say, please save my file under the name variant minus something, and then hope that this works reproducibly. And in the same way, we know that LLMs cannot calculate, so we often kind of try to find other solutions like tool binding, which is now possible, and structured outputs, which can be a solution for that. So instead of trying to calculate with the probabilistic next token generation, the LLM realizes, I have this Python function which can do a multiplication for me. I'll call it and then I'll get the result. And then at the higher level, we also need to take care of the robustness of the system. And then we get into DevOps, which is, again, another whole ecosystem that you need to onboard into if you want to do something like deployment. So we need to minimize the complexity of the system so we have a chance, at least, to be in charge of the system. If we have just a wild combination of all sorts of agents that can do whatever they want, it's really hard to constrain them and make it reproducible for the user. We can do integration testing, but given the combinatorial nature of integration testing, imagine you have 5 agents, you need to test all combinations that are possible. You run out of money really fast. And then the gold standard is that you have monitoring and continuous integration, and then you get into also legal, ethical concerns, like are you allowed to record the queries that your users give you? Are you allowed to statistically evaluate them? Then they need to click a checkbox. Yes, it's fine. With ChatGPT, for example, people were very concerned that the model may save their information and then use it for training the next generation of models. So there's this whole other thing that we need to consider. And I'm coming back to this now. So we have ideally a nice setup of application developers that take framework components but give back to the frameworks, and basic libraries that develop rapidly, but that then are taken up by the framework components and also improved by the component developers because they say, my application developers want this particular feature, so let me contribute it back to you. And it needs to work, in my opinion, like that the community is really aware what the other layers are doing that they're in contact with. So for example, if you want to develop an application for a specific user type, you need to talk to these users. You need to first set up some ground rules, and then you need to be in a loop with them to figure out whether the solution that you developed really does it for them or whether there is some other problem that you need to solve. And the same thing goes for the component developers, which I would count myself as. If I look at the custom applications that are being built with BioChatter, I need to talk to these developers and ask them whether it works for them or whether there's something that they may need. And also the same goes for the lowest level. And at the moment, particularly since everything is going so fast and it's quite early, there is quite the attractiveness in just going to the basic libraries because you know you can program and you have a specific application in mind. So you just throw something together really quickly with LangChain without having it tested, without having continuous integration. You know, you can send a request to OpenAI and it gives you back an answer. Perfect. Let's deploy it. But I will highly discourage that because not only does it make the application that you build less reliable, it also kind of prevents this whole mechanism of self-improvement that is possible by this being aware of the other layers and ideally giving back, which is my main point in this. if we want, as a research community, to be able to keep up with the rapid developments and the multi-billion investments of the companies that develop the basic layers of the models, and sometimes even very specific things, like health applications, then it doesn't work if every 3 to 10 people group does it on their own. So reinvention of the wheel is a real problem, and we need to find ways to get around it in science. That is kind of my conviction. Because otherwise you get this issue, relevant XKCD here. And I've seen this multiple times, that there are like thankless, really integral parts of software systems. And then once, even 2 years after a maintainer has stopped working on a project, all of a sudden there's an operating system update and then everything breaks down. And this is exactly what we want to prevent by being aware of what we are using and ideally giving back. So we have, as an example, this Open Targets project, which is my main affiliation with the EBI, which is OTA 3088. There is this Open Targets platform. If you're not familiar, it's basically a resource on diseases and genes that could be connected by the gene being a target in the disease, and you get a lot of information on the genes in a specific kind of disease, and then you can get to your target quicker. And the project deals with exactly implementing these principles in the Open Targets platform so that we can modernize the knowledge management. So for the extraction of information, as I mentioned, we have this new development, which we call BioChatter, to get information out of text and images. We want to represent these data that Open Targets accumulate for 10 years now in a very flexible way so that people can build their own custom representations of Open Targets data. And we want to then tie it down to the chatbot level where we say, now we have this bunch of data, but it's really hard to figure out where to get what and what can we do with it. So we want to use LLMs to improve the accessibility. Plus, we want to really monitor the specific questions that users of Open Targets have and develop our solutions with the questions that we need to answer in mind and monitor this. So as a final outlook, I think it would be great to have what I call an integrated research environment inspired by the integrated development environments, IDEs, that are very popular in programming for a good reason, because you have all the components that you need for software development in one place. And this is not a short-term goal, but it would be nice to have everything we need for the scientific process also in one place. So if you imagine someone starting a scientific project, let's say starting a PhD, first you need to catch up with the background. And for this, you traditionally go to a bunch of papers that your PI gives you, or you maybe look at some web databases and try to figure out what is even going on in this very complex problem. So it would be nice if you just had a 24/7 assistant that you could talk about the background, but it needs to be robust. It cannot tell you nonsense about the background. Then once you've caught up, you might want to design experiments to drive science forward. And here I think it's very fortunate that LLMs can inhibit personas. So you can, for example, as a biologist, talk to a statistician to make sure that your experimental design has enough power. Or if you're a clinician, maybe you want to talk to a machine learning persona to make sure that your idea of the next foundation model is somehow grounded in fact. Then when it comes to the application, and the application has anything to do with softwares, we can use the function calling, the tool binding functionalities of LLMs to help us execute the experiments. And then we usually get a bunch of results, which we need to interpret. And then it's time to, again, go back to the corpus of knowledge that we have to compare the results that we have to the existing knowledge. For example, the papers, was something like this reported before? Does it contradict something that I've heard before? Then we want to usually structure and critique some dissemination. And that doesn't mean ChatGPT write my paper for me, but rather using it as an editorial assistant. Is this paragraph concise? Should I maybe split this sentence up into 2 sentences? This kind of usage. And ultimately, then we also have the peer review process, which is also plagued by several inefficiencies. So in order to improve this, which is mainly done by scientists on their free time, we could also implement structures that make the feedback easier to give and also more constructive. So have layers in between that maybe prevent submission of reviews that insult the paper, all uppercase, and rather enable constructive criticism. And with this vision, I would like to acknowledge everybody that made this work possible. Most of it was done in the lab of Julio Zayas Rodriguez, who is now also at EBI. Many thanks to him and everybody on that team, all of the other contributors that I've met through the projects, also the sponsors that made the work possible. You for your attention. And a bit of a shameless plug here, since I've recently started a lab, there's also some jobs available. You can find them on my website or on LinkedIn or something like that. And please stay open source, get in touch if there's anything you would like to talk about or collaborate about. Everything we do is open source from day one. And if there's any questions, I'm very happy to take them now.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for this wonderful talk, and thanks everyone for joining in. Okay, so we can take the questions now. So one of the most popular questions here is around the prompt engineering. So do users need to carefully design their prompts to achieve meaningful results, or are there predefined prompts and applications tailored for specific clinical roles?
That is an excellent question and not something that we can really answer at this point, which again enforces my opinion about the benchmarks because it really depends, for example, on the model that you use. I think yesterday saw the release of TX Gemma by Google, which was kind of shadowed by the Gemini release. But TX Gemma is a model that Google specifically fine-tuned for the biomedical treatment derivation, toxicology, this kind of question. So in this case, if you use a model that has been fine-tuned, or for example, the project that Melanie also introduced, where she fine-tuned a model for the recognition of protein residues, then your model behavior, the internal model behavior, is very strong, and it's very hard to override with prompts. Or you may not need prompts if you have such a specific model. If you just go to GPT-4o, which is created by OpenAI to be very generic, then you can maybe achieve a lot with prompts. And this is even more true for the generic open source models, which often don't have this like layered thing that OpenAI does, where I don't know how many things they have in between the model and the actual response or the alignment that they do. If you have a very raw model, then often you can get huge performance benefits by doing prompting. And that's not only specific instructions, but there's also few shot methods. And you can also use RAG, few shot prompting methods. And there's really no single answer to this. And again, this is why you need to know what you're doing in terms of the questions that you have, and then have a specific benchmark for this, because then this allows you to answer that question for exactly your use case. So that's kind of my take on that.
Thank you. How did you generate the benchmarking data set?
So this is, I have an example here for the connectivity between the knowledge graph framework, the BioCipher framework, and the BioChatter LLM application, which is a stepwise procedure. And this may be a good example for explaining how the benchmark works. So we have in BioCipher this grounding where we tell the BioCipher software, but then in extension also BioChatter, what does my knowledge consist of? Which is not just the names and the spellings, etc., which is it's a huge part in generating queries, because obviously you can't generate a query which doesn't contain the entities that you have in the graph or spells them wrong, right? That is one technical aspect, but it also includes some contextualization for the LLM. So what am I even dealing with? I get the question from the user, but I also need to know in what context am I getting this question. And for these benchmarks, we basically define in a YAML definition this schema, the questions, and then some system prompts and a ground truth. So in this case, it is, for example, regular expressions that we expect in a query that is generated for something like Cypher or SQL. And then BioChatter does its thing. So we go through a multi-step process where we first select entities from these entities here in the benchmark. Then we select relationships that might be interesting for the particular question in each of the individual benchmark questions. Then we select the properties, and then we use all of these selected things to generate the query finally. And then what the benchmark does is it compares the query with these regular expression fragments that we expect. For example, we expect a Cypher query to start with match. And if you give the same information in the prompt to a model, so we give to all of the models that we have in the benchmark this file and the user question and some system instructions, etc. So what you would do if you just went to ChatGPT and pasted everything in there, then you get this very mixed performance. And if you do the same thing, so you give the same information, but through BioChatter, which then goes through this process, you almost immediately get this like very high increase in performance across all of the models. And this you can do with various other things. So we are now writing a paper about an application in longevity research where the target is like an audience that wants to know about certain interventions, whether they should do them. And for this, we created 25 profiles of typical users, which are young users that are very fitness oriented, or old users that have maybe multi-morbidity and want to know if they should take a drug or not. And these were validated by physicians and then modularized into this combinatorial data set where we also added confounders for the LLMs that wouldn't confuse humans, but have been known to confuse LLMs. So from these 25 profiles, we generated 1,000 test items through this YAML definition format. And then we send it through all of the models. And then we get like a summary statistics of which model performs how well in each of the categories that we have, like how comprehensive is the answer? Does it suggest correctly whether the intervention should be done? Like, should the person lose weight or not? Should the person do more exercise or not? And then also compare the gold standard answers from the clinicians with the answers that the LLM gave in response to the user query. So basically, the benchmark is laid out in this YAML form, and there is a bit of an art involved in coming up with nice unit tests to isolate specific forms of performance. And this then is added to the BioChatter repository where the benchmark currently lives and executed across this combinatorial multitude of different options.
Really like your approach of using benchmarking for testing robustness, as LLM research increasingly uses chain of thought reasoning that can allow transparency to users to see how an LLM has justified a response. Is this something that could be viewed in BioChatter or similar approaches, or is the LLM layer buried too deep in the stack to be able to see its reasoning?
No, this is very transparent. Like this is one of our main missions, basically, to make it more transparent than, for example, OpenAI. Because obviously we cannot compete with OpenAI in terms of manpower and the raw resources that they have. But what we do have is this mission of transparency, open source, etc. So there is this balance to find, and that is why we put a huge focus on the transparency. So the all of the different reasoning steps of the LLMs are visible. And we also make them visible, for example, in the front end. If you, for example, look at this decider genetics use case, we have a web app where you can do these RAG things, for example. You always see the query that the model has used to retrieve the knowledge, which knowledge was retrieved, and then also how it made its decision. There's this other framework that I find quite interesting, which is called Chainlit. It's like an extension or a development of Streamlit, which interacts natively with LangChain and shows you the reasoning. Like you can have a little downward arrow, which you can click, and then you see the reasoning steps of the model automatically. We haven't had a chance to implement it yet, but I think we are going to add it to the roster of different softwares that we have so that if you have a chain of thought problem, you can just out of the box start with this, and then you can expand all the reasoning that is going on behind the scenes. So yes, very important, and I suggest you absolutely do this. It still doesn't allow for complete explainability because the models are very convincing if they confabulate. And if you don't know the answer to the question, then you also have no chance of, in the particular use case, determining whether the model is now confabulating something, giving you a reference that doesn't exist or something very subtle, or whether it's true. So there is still some residual problem remaining, even if you see all the reasoning steps.
Around your suggestions on anyone who is a beginner in this field. So I'm a beginner with a background in biology, and I want to learn new skills in AI, machine learning, other advancements in field of biology. A structured learning pathway and guidance would be extremely helpful. Do you have any suggestions on any resources?
Resources. So when it comes to the basics, I think people really love this course by Andrew Ng, um, which is like oriented towards the interested but not knowledgeable at all. Uh, it's always helpful to be embedded in an interdisciplinary context, but that's obviously not an option for everybody because you don't have complete control over your environment. But you can seek out organizations. So I really like, for example, PyOpenSci. I'm active in PyOpenSci, which is just one example of communities that try to drive open science in the software field. And there are other like national and supranational organizations that try to build these bridges. Elixir is one of them, which has a lot of educational workshops. EBI, as we see in this very instance, is another one. And on a personal level, I would say just get into it, try to talk to people at conferences, or we also provide, if you go to our documentation, we provide a community channel on Zulip. Other organizations do it as well. It depends a bit on your interest. For example, if you're very interested in single cell sequencing and applications there, then you could probably join the SCVerse community. So basically, these communities that have a mission of transporting knowledge and including people, I think these are the ones that you should seek out.
Thank you.
Bioconductor, I forgot to mention. Like if you're more in the R ecosystem, I learned bioinformatics through Bioconductor.
Great. Thank you. We have one interesting question. I think in your talk, you mentioned at some point that LLMs are not interpretable. So there's one question. When you say LLMs are not interpretable, doesn't this make the next session of this series uninteresting? So the next webinar that we have is domain-specific knowledge extraction from scientific text using LLMs. Could you comment on that?
I think I refer to calibration, which is different from interpretability in that it's certainty measurement rather than trying to explain the responses. Also, explainability is a huge research field. So there are ways in which you can post hoc explain things, but they are limited. And so far, the holy grail of making large, like billion parameter models explainable in themselves is just failing because of the high complexity of the models. In the same way that we cannot complain the complexity of mammalian cells, for example, because it's just a ton of information that we don't know where to look. In the same way, we cannot explain the reasoning that's going on in a trillion parameter model, which is like the state of the art now. And I don't think this is a contradiction to the next seminar because we are using these models in order to give us results extracted from text, which are mapped to certain entities or certain concepts, right? We always have a purpose in these text extractions, and NLP is not new. So we have always tried to extract, for example, as Melanie has shown, we extract information about proteins, for example, from scientific literature, because scientific literature was written for humans and nobody thought of the machine readability aspects even a couple of years ago. And now it's all hitting us in the face that it would be great to have this organized in a structured way, but try to get authors in biology to put everything into ontological notations. It's just not possible. So to bridge this gap, which you usually needed a human for, we can now use LLMs for because they have a real world context that rivals a domain expert's. So this is the contextualization is what we use in the LLMs. And we can test that. We can just compare them to the traditional NLP approaches and see, do they give us more robust results in terms of determining, is this a disease or a side effect or whatever was mentioned in this text? And so far, it's looking pretty good for the LLMs. So they don't need to be perfect. They just need to be better than what we currently have.